Hello and welcome. I'm Leanne Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. The US stock market slumps for a second day as Wall Street turns red. China hits back at Trump's levies with an eye-watering 35% tariff. Netanyahu is expected at the White House in a few weeks for his second meeting with the US president. And the deadline looms. TikTok must be sold to a non-Chinese buyer by tomorrow or face a US ban. To our top story, and the US stock market has slumped for a second day running in the wake of Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs. The largest stock index, the S&P 500, dropped 4.2% today, while the Nasdaq fell 4.4%. It follows yesterday's disastrous crash, which saw the worst day in US markets since the pandemic. Tesla, of course, owned by Elon Musk, was down almost 4% in early trading, whilst Apple was down more than 3%. Let's get the views of economist Laurie Laird. Laurie, thank you so much for joining me. First off, the FTSE 100.
Yeah, good evening.
Evening. Let's start with the FTSE 100. It's suffered its biggest daily drop in more than 5 years, since 2020. Are we surprised that this is happening?
I'm a little bit surprised, to be honest. FTSE down about 4.3%. Now the DAX in Germany down about 4.2%. So a similar fall. The French benchmark down about 3.7%. But I am a little bit surprised to see the FTSE falling as much as these European markets, simply because the UK got off a little bit more lightly on tariffs than Europe did. Tariffs of 10% onto UK goods going into the US. The EU hit at a much higher rate. Also, the UK sends proportionately more services to the US. These are, we're not quite sure, but it doesn't appear that services will be hit with tariffs in the way goods will. So if you compare the UK to its European partners, competitors, depends on what day of the week it is for that one. But if you compare the UK economy to the others in Europe, it's not going to, on the surface, suffer as much as, say, Germany or France or Italy, which also exports a lot of goods to the US, shouldn't get hit that badly. On the flip side, though, for the UK, there was a massive fall in bond yields today. That means the prices of bonds went up. When there's a demand for bonds, yields go down. Now, bond yields, gilt yields, are what the government pays to borrow. The UK government is borrowing quite a bit, historically high amounts. The price of borrowing just got a lot cheaper in the UK because of market events today. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. I think the UK government will be quietly relieved to see this fall in gilt yields.
Let's move on to Trump. He's urging the Fed Chair Jerome Powell to cut interest rates. He says the economic effects will include, but Jerome Powell has come out and basically said in a statement today that the economic effects of the tariffs will include higher inflation and slower growth for the United States. What exactly do you make of Jerome Powell's analysis?
I mean, the Fed really is in a bit of a pickle here. And Powell just finished his press conference. As an aside, the man is such a good communicator. He made it very clear that he doesn't know what's going to happen. He expressed a degree of, I guess, relief that we now know what the policy is, right? Trump has been teasing us all for so many months. There'll be tariffs, announcing tariffs, delaying those tariffs. We now have a sense of what policy will look like. What we don't have a sense of yet is where these tariffs will fall most heavily. As you said, Powell mentioned there will be an increase in inflation. There has to be. The cost of goods will increase, but it will also, most likely, will have an effect on consumption when people spend less, particularly in the U.S., which is a consumer-led economy. 2/3 of GDP is consumer spending. If consumers spend less because things are more expensive, that has an automatic slowdown in the economy. Powell did say that he feels like the Fed is positioned very well at the moment. They have the luxury of being able to wait for a little bit before deciding what kind of fine-tuning policy what kind of fine-tuning and policy may be needed. But people I talk to in the markets are extremely worried about Powell's staying power. About an hour ago, as you mentioned, Trump exhorted Powell to cut rates using capital letters. He's always sort of implied that Powell doesn't know what he's doing. And there's a real, it doesn't look like Trump can fire Powell, but he's also done a lot of things that we didn't think were legal either, and is carrying those out as policy. And this is the biggest worry about amongst investors in the U.S. and further afield, that Powell will either be removed or neutered in some way. That will send a very, very confusing message to investors, particularly at a time where inflation expectations, and this is something that the Fed watches very carefully. The feeling is if people expect higher inflation, they're going to ask for pay rises, making inflation a self-fulfilling prophecy. Inflation expectations are at the highest they've been in 3 decades. So people are very worried about whether Powell's effectiveness may be cut because of political bickering.
Yes, absolutely. That is a very good point. And when we go to China, China has hit back with additional tariffs of 34%. Trump has come out and said, China, basically, it's panicking. But do you think we can expect further retaliations from other countries? And now, has China's retaliation sparked a trade war?
I don't know when, kind of a trade skirmish becomes a trade war. My feeling is if it's not now, it's maybe tomorrow or the next day. If we're not in a trade war now, we're pretty darn close. And I do think that China acting first may give other countries cover to begin announcing their retaliatory tariffs. The European Union has made it very clear that they are preparing some retaliation. I thought we'd see something. I thought we would have already seen something from the EU. I suspect we'll see something next week. The UK is playing it a little more coyly. I think the UK feels that somehow Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, can charm Donald Trump in some sort of way. But I do think China was the first to break, and we will see other retaliation coming to the fore. But this 34% that China announced, this is 34% on top of tariffs that were already existing. So that puts the effective tariff rate of U.S. exports to China at close to 50% on average. And some of these exports come from constituents that have tended to be pro-Trump, like farmers. China's very dependent on U.S. soybeans. These are going to be 50% more expensive next week.
Laurie, we seem to have lost you there due to the connection. Economist Laurie Laird, thank you so much for joining me, and apologies for those technical problems, but thank you once again for your insights. China said it will impose an additional 34% tariff on US goods from the 10th of April. It's in response to President Trump's announcement of additional levies to China of 20%, now totaling 54%. The United States trade deficit with China reached over $295 billion last year. Responding on Truth Social, Trump told his followers China played it wrong. They panicked, the one thing they cannot afford to do. We can now get live reaction from our correspondent Patrick Falk in Singapore. Patrick, a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me. So China was handed the highest rate during Trump's tariff announcement and was subjected to tariffs in his first term. Was China's hardline response that we've seen basically inevitable?
Well, I think China's made it pretty clear all along that it intended to hit back with strong countermeasures. This has been consistent with reactionary moves that it's made previously to Donald Trump's previous two rounds of tariffs imposed since he came to office once again. So this was perhaps inevitable. It was certainly expected. But one of the things that's perhaps interesting about it is the timing of all of this. Remember, Trump's tariffs were due to kick in just a matter of days. So policymakers in Beijing were forced to, you might say, to act quickly. At the same time, experts that we've spoken to certainly feel that the 34% tariffs imposed on China this time round was higher than was expected. We were keeping an eye out yesterday to see if there'd be an announcement from the Commerce Ministry, but that wasn't forthcoming. You do wonder whether or not policymakers had to go back to the drawing board overnight before issuing any sort of response. And now we've seen that. The big concern really is now that this is going to deepen differences between Washington and Beijing. And there were some very strong words from the Commerce Ministry today saying that these moves by the Trump administration were inconsistent with World Trade Organization rules, and that it undermined the legitimate rights and interests of China, and also that it was an example of the US bullying other countries.
Patrick, President Trump has told investors that his policies will never change, despite China, of course, asking them to reconsider. What will this mean for consumers in both America and China?
Well, look, I don't think Beijing ever thought that any of its words would have any impact or that it would make President Trump change his mind. And a lot of people in China feel that there's very little room for negotiating with Washington at this point. But experts do certainly agree that this is going to hit consumers in the US and that they are ultimately going to be paying more for goods shipped from China to America. The same doesn't necessarily apply the other way round, because the reality is that China buys a lot less from the US than the other way round. That said, exports had been one rare bright spot for the Chinese economy in recent times. And so this is going to hurt. A lot of experts will tell you, this is at the same time going to impact consumer demand because it's going to impact the economy. That is something that China is trying very hard to address. And there is this sense of frustration in Beijing that Washington's moves are very much designed to undermine China's economic recovery right now.
Yes, absolutely, because China has definitely been struggling economically. Beijing has placed export controls on 7 rare earth minerals needed for consumer electronics. How will this affect the US?
Yeah, look, this is interesting in particular because a lot of people would say that the other moves are very much sort of tit for tat. These are much more targeted. America imports nearly all of its rare earth minerals. China produces 90% of them. And this isn't going to just affect electronics. It's also going to affect defense industries in the US as well as EVs. So there is going to be a significant impact in that sense. And it's going to be difficult to see how exactly the US is going to replace that, but it is an example of China weaponizing an area where it really dominates, where it dominates in producing rare earth minerals. Some would say the flip side of that, though, is that might see the US and perhaps other countries, because remember, this doesn't just apply to the US. This ban has been placed on all countries. It may galvanize other countries to find alternative supply chains to address the matter.
It's actually been a holiday in China today, so the markets have been closed. We're having a look at the drop in global stocks today. Obviously, in the UK, the FTSE significantly lower, S&P 500 also, if we look at the US stocks. What are we expecting to happen when the markets reopen on Monday?
Well, look, it's very difficult to say, but I think the consensus is there is going to be a lot more volatility ahead with downside pressure. I think another thing that's going to be interesting in particular is looking at how it's going to impact markets in Southeast Asia. As we know, the tariffs that were imposed on countries like Vietnam and Cambodia were unexpected. They were a lot higher than had been anticipated as well. So these markets are going to be hit particularly hard. Also, there's a big concern about how this is going to impact supply chains, and it's something that Singapore is very much concerned about. Export-oriented economies are concerned about how this is going to slow down global growth and slow down exports, and that's going to affect supply chains in a big way.
Patrick Falk in Singapore, thank you so much for your insights. Hope to have you on again soon. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. The US Senate has confirmed TV host Dr. Mehmet Oz will run Medicare and Medicaid services, the agency that oversees Americans' healthcare. Dr. Oz trained as a surgeon before pursuing a media career in the early 2000s. Trump has previously said there is no physician more capable to make America healthy again. The comedian Russell Brand has been charged with rape and 2 counts of sexual assault between 1999 and 2005. The Metropolitan Police say he's also been charged with 1 count of oral rape and 1 count of indecent assault. The allegations relate to 4 women. He's due to appear at Westminster's Magistrates Court on Friday, the 2nd of May. The UK could lose 2 of its assault ships in an attempt to cut costs. The 2 vessels, HMS Bulwark and HMS Albion, may be sold off to Brazil. It comes even as British Prime Minister Keir Starmer promises to boost defence spending. And tributes have poured in for Manoj Kumar, the veteran Indian actor and director who has died at the age of 87. The award-winning actor was known for his patriotic movies, especially in the 1960s and 1970s. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi called him an icon of Indian cinema. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will probably visit the White House in a few weeks. That's according to a report by the American website Axios. US President Donald Trump seemed to confirm the visit on board Air Force One last night. Here's what he had to say.
I spoke to him today, as a matter of fact, and I think he's going to be coming to our country sometime in the not-too-distant future, maybe next week. And we'll speak about Israel, and we'll speak about what's going on. That's another thing we'd like to get solved, and I think we will get it solved. But I think he very well may be coming next month. Benjamin Netanyahu.
We can now join our correspondent, Trent Murray, who is in Tel Aviv. Trent, thanks so much for joining me. So if this visit does go ahead, they will have lots to discuss, including tariffs and the Gaza ceasefire.
Yeah, that's right. The president there aboard Air Force One saying it could be as soon as next week. Now, the Prime Minister's office here in Israel has said they don't have anything further to add to that commentary. As you rightly say, Axios is saying it could take a little while longer than next week. But this is a pretty big coup in many ways for Prime Minister Netanyahu to be heading back to the States so soon. He was there in early February. In fact, the first foreign leader to visit President Trump after his return to the White House. And as you rightly say, there is plenty for them to undoubtedly discuss. It, of course, comes at a time where we're seeing Israel stepping up its military manoeuvres in Gaza, and we also are seeing an increased force posture from the United States itself, both with its bombing campaign in Yemen. They are bringing in additional military resources here as well, including ships. And we are also tracking some reporting today out of South Korea, where Yonhap, the state news agency there, is reporting that the Americans are preparing to take air defense systems from the Korean Peninsula and place them into the Middle East. So we are seeing as I say, the Americans and the Israelis together both increasing their force posture and their military manoeuvres. Why are they doing that? I mean, there is some thoughts in this region. Diplomats are concerned that potentially this is preparing for some sort of showdown with Iran when it comes to their nuclear program. We also know, of course, that some of those Biden-era weapons restrictions that were in place on Israel are now being lifted. Just today, we are hearing 20,000 assault rifles, which former President Biden had been holding up, are now being sent to Israel. The old administration was concerned those rifles could be used by Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank. Seemingly, that is not a concern that President Trump's administration has, because we are being told those assault weapons have been signed off in the past 24 hours.
Trent, Israel forces have announced they're expanding ground operations in northern Gaza. What are they aiming to do?
Yeah, that's right. Fresh statements today from the IDF that military operation is expanding around Gaza City in the north. Now, this is on top of what we saw earlier in the week, where they expanded their operations in the south around Rafah. Now, what they are saying is that the purpose is to expand the security zone that the IDF can operate in, and that they are working to, and I'm quoting here, destroy and clear the area of terrorist and terrorist infrastructure. Prime Minister Netanyahu himself has said that the army is now working to try and divide Gaza up and to seize territory in order to try and force Hamas to hand over the remaining hostages. Some initial estimates suggest that the IDF is now fully in control of about 17% of the total area of the Gaza Strip. It would appear, based on what we've seen both today and earlier this week, they are now looking to expand that land oversight that they're trying to gain.
Hamas has said it's ready to release all hostages this week in exchange for a permanent ceasefire. What has the response been from Israel on this?
Yeah, this is a proposal that I would expect the Israelis will likely reject. That is certainly the suggestion that we are already hearing out of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem from government officials. A red line for the Israelis is Hamas remaining in any sort of capacity of governing or being in power in Gaza moving forward. What Hamas is putting forward, though, is effectively phase 2 of that Trump administration negotiated ceasefire deal. That deal was supposed to see the remaining hostages returned in exchange for the IDF completely withdrawing. But Benjamin Netanyahu, even though he signed that original ceasefire, all of the signals suggest he doesn't have any sort of desire to go down that path right now. He wants to maintain IDF boots on the ground in order to try and prevent Hamas rearming. But of course, the other side of that argument is that there are many Israeli families here still incredibly concerned about their remaining hostages. We are expecting yet more protests this weekend here in Tel Aviv, calling for the return of the hostages back to Israel.
Trent Murray in Tel Aviv, always great to have you on. Thank you for joining me. Let's take another look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. Myanmar's junta leader has met with the Prime Minister of India and Thailand at a summit in Bangkok. The meeting comes a week after a 7.7 magnitude earthquake devastated parts of Myanmar, killing over 3,000 people. Until now, Min Aung Hlaing has been shunned by most world leaders after leading a coup that overthrew the elected government back in 2021. Now, at least 7 people have died after tornadoes and severe thunderstorms have hit southern states of America. Deaths were recorded in western Tennessee, Missouri, and Indiana. The National Weather Service have described the severe weather as once-in-a-generation storms. Denmark's Prime Minister has said it will not give up Greenland to the US. During an official visit to the Arctic island, she responded to repeated threats from Donald Trump, telling him you can't annex other countries. Her 3-day trip follows last week's controversial visit by a US delegation, including Vice President J.D. Vance. Kensington Palace has announced the Prince of Wales Earthshot Prize will be held in Brazil in November. The Global Environmental Award, founded by Prince William, gives £1 million to 5 winners who offer solutions to some of the world's biggest climate problems. The Earthshot Prize is a 10-year project, past ceremonies held in London, Boston, Singapore, and also in Cape Town. Now, South Korea's Constitutional Court has upheld a decision by the country's legislator to impeach President Yoon Suk-yeol. It ends months of uncertainty and legal wrangling following Yoon's failed martial law order several months ago. But tensions do remain high in Seoul following this verdict. Frank Smith reports.
South Korea's Constitutional Court upheld the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol and removed him from office. Acting Chief Justice Moon Hyung-bae spoke for 20 minutes outlining the ways in which President Yoon had violated the Constitution. When he imposed martial law with his decree on December 3rd, he didn't get the approval of the cabinet, holding just a 5-minute cabinet meeting before leaving abruptly to issue his public decree. Then he sent in the military to arrest lawmakers, when in fact, by the Constitution, he should inform the National Assembly of a martial law decree. So the Constitutional Court, again, found that he egregiously violated the Constitution and unanimously voted to remove him from office. Since that decree, there have been widespread demonstrations in South Korea almost daily up until this morning, up until following the decision issued from the Constitutional Court. 60% of South Koreans wanted to see President Yoon removed. Still, he enjoyed 30% of support. Certainly, conservatives in South Korea are disappointed, but the People Power Party, President Yoon's party, has said that they accept the decision from the Constitutional Court, which now triggers a snap presidential election in South Korea. The favored candidate for that presidential election here is Lee Jae-myung, the leader of the Democratic Party, who previously lost the election in 2022 to Yoon Suk-yeol. That presidential election will take place sometime within the next 60 days, with June 3rd earmarked as the day a new president will be voted for here in South Korea.
Frank Smith there in Seoul. Thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at the top business news. The risk of a US and global recession this year has risen to 60% from 40% following Donald Trump's sweeping reciprocal tariffs. That's according to the Wall Street brokerage JP Morgan. On Wednesday, Trump imposed a 10% baseline tax on all imports to the US and higher duties on dozens of other countries. Now, the US economy added far more jobs than actually expected in March, but the recent tariffs could shake the labor market in the months ahead. The average hourly earnings were up 0.3%. That's up 3.8% year on year, while unemployment rose to 4.2%, and that was up from 4.1%. Turning to all the sports news now, an Alpine driver, Jack Doohan, has suffered a high-speed crash during a practice at the Japanese Grand Prix. It was caused from his failure to shut the DRS overtaking aid. It meant his car had less grip as he entered the 160 mph corner. Doohan walked away uninjured, but his car was destroyed. And Tottenham Hotspur's manager has hit out at the time-consuming VAR process that saw Pep Sarr's goal cancelled in their 1-0 defeat at Chelsea on Thursday. And Postecoglou also said football was heading towards being refereed by artificial intelligence. Spurs, who are 14th in the Premier League, do host Southampton on Sunday. And the countdown is on for TikTok, who has hours to go to find a non-Chinese owner. The social media platform used by more than 170 million Americans could be shut down in the United States if it does not find an alternative to its current owner, ByteDance. Fears over security prompted a previous ban. However, President Donald Trump has stressed his administration were close to finding a buyer. It's believed Amazon has made a last-minute bid. I'm now joined by a distinguished professor of Communication and Media at Missouri State University, Dr. Brian L. Ott. Thank you, Professor. I really appreciate you joining me this evening. So is the TikTok deal within reach? And why is Donald Trump so keen to strike an agreement?
So President Trump is aggressively trying to close this deal to divest ownership of TikTok from the Chinese company ByteDance. And he's pursuing it not for principles, and he's not pursuing it for national security reasons either. He is mostly interested in the self-image that it would promote. Donald Trump is always trying to represent himself as a strong man and a tough negotiator. And he wants to be able to close this deal, particularly at a moment in the U.S. where we're facing economic crisis created by his new tariffs.
It's interesting because he wasn't keen on TikTok and then he kind of changed his mind about it, didn't he, when he saw how much he was getting the younger voter involved in TikTok. So lots of people have been talking about that. But you mentioned national security there. TikTok is facing a ban due to national security concerns over the platform's links to China. What risks do users face, and is Trump actually concerned about national security in this sense?
I actually don't think President Trump is concerned about national security. You can't have it both ways. You can't say on the one hand that this platform is a danger or a risk to national security, and then have a 75-day period where you extend an opportunity for someone else to come in as a buyer. And just yesterday, President Trump suggested that if he's not able to close this deal, he'll just extend the deadline again. Well, you can't suggest on the one hand that it's a national security threat. On the other hand, suggest that there's no deadline by which this has to be met. So my sense of what's really going on here is that this is a tremendously successful company, social media company that represented competition for US-based social media companies. And this is really an attempt to eliminate competition for them.
If no deal is reached, will TikTok be banned in the US? And what will this mean for millions of influencers who make a living off this platform and users? You said Trump could extend the fact that TikTok could carry on, but inevitably there has to be a solution.
Right. So to be clear, TikTok is already banned. So the law was passed in 2024, and the law is in effect. So TikTok is already banned in the U.S. But what Donald Trump has done is he has deferred enforcement of that ban. Right. So it's actually the app is already illegal, but no one is being punished for use of the app. I think he will continue to extend the grace period where there's no kind of punishment until he's actually able to close some kind of deal. What people have suggested from behind the scenes is that we are in fact getting closer and closer to a deal, although it is far likely to be less tough on ByteDance and the Chinese government than what was originally proposed.
So what would the deal as currently proposed do, and what will it look like?
So effectively, what the negotiations are attempting to do is to create a new third-party entity that's based in the United States. And that third-party entity would take over, if not ownership, at least control of the algorithm. The algorithm is what allows TikTok to track user behavior and then to push new content based on that behavior. And at least the negotiations that I'm hearing, the negotiations that have been leaked so far to the media, suggest that what the US-based company would do is actually try to find ways to monetize those algorithms more than they're already monetized by promoting advertising, which is really the aim of all social media platforms.
So, Professor, one question that I want to end with. I'm not on TikTok. I'm trying to learn about it, but my much younger nephew is. What makes TikTok so popular compared to other social media platforms that we use?
Primarily because it traffics in short form video. So we very much live in a digital world of a visual culture. And so people are constantly looking for ways to communicate using short form video, and they can very easily on their own mobile devices create content that is brief, easy to put together, and easy to post because it doesn't take up much memory space on TikTok. And that's why the app is so popular.
Distinguished Professor of Communication and Media at Missouri State University, Dr. Brian L. Ott. Professor Dr. Brian L. Ott, apologies. Thank you so much for joining me. A reminder of our top stories. The US stock market slumps for a second day as Wall Street turns red. China hits back at Trump's levies with an eye-watering 35% tariff. Netanyahu is expected at the White House in a few weeks for his second meeting with the US president. And the deadline looms. TikTok must be sold to a non-Chinese buyer by tomorrow or face a US ban. And that's all from us on W News. Thanks for joining us. Counterpoints with Melinda Nusafora is coming up next, followed by Hadley Gamble's special interview with Sir Robin Niblett, the former director of Chatham House. And of course, don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson with GNT. Goodbye.